I am calling the,
I think you must be the magic term here.
I'm going to call the Monday, July 18th, 2022 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. Tonight's Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting will be held in person and virtually by using Zoom. As chair, I will be leading the Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting, and the public is welcome to participate when invited throughout the meeting. Members of the public may attend the meeting in person or join us online via Zoom. If you experience any audio problems on Zoom, we suggest you leave the meeting and then rejoin. This usually corrects the problem. Additional instructions on how to participate are posted online at burnsvillemn.gov in the public meeting calendar. As usual, tonight's meeting is available for viewing on BCTV and on the city's website. If you're unable to participate this evening and would like to submit a public testimony, I encourage you to email your comments to city staff or mail your comments directly to City Hall. Now on to tonight's agenda. The first item is the adoption of the agenda. Do any members of the commission have any changes to the agenda tonight? No changes from commissioners. Staff, do you have any changes to tonight's agenda?
Nothing from staff.
Perfect. May I have a motion for the adoption of the agenda?
So move.
Gary moves. Any seconds?
I'll second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Perfect. Now we will move on to our second part of the agenda. Approval of the June 6th, 2022 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting minutes. Commissioners, are there any changes to the meeting minutes? No changes from commissioners. Staff, are there any changes?
Nothing from staff.
Nothing from staff. May I have a motion to approve the minutes? And do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? That passes. At this time, are there any members of the public on Zoom who wish to speak?
Commissioner Woolman, right now I'm not seeing anybody pop up on my phone, but I did hear before the meeting started that we were having a few issues, so if we can give it one more minute, or a few more seconds anyway, let's make sure that if people want to speak, they have a chance.
Absolutely.
We're good to go.
Good to go. Are there anyone present here tonight who is interested in speaking at this time? Right. Perfect. And so let's move on to the approval of the wetland permit and replacement plan for the sanitary landfill. Come on up, Mr. Daryl Jacobson and Kimley Horn Consultants Ashley Payne to present to us on the wetland permit replacement plan.
All right, Madam Chair, Commissioners, thank you. Yes, tonight we have the wetland permit replacement plan for the Burnsville Sanitary Landfill expansion. They've kind of had an expansion in since, if you looked at the background, since the early 2000s. This is kind of a modification of that plan that was approved back then. So there was some different development areas identified in the original expansion plan that also had a wetland permit and replacement plan. You can see the numbers here. It was divided into west and north, and the total impacts proposed at that time was just under 48 acres. At that time, the mitigation that they were proposing for those wetland impacts was going to be done through creating wetlands on site or on nearby sites. And so kind of the current project's status is they've had, some of those impacts have happened. So some of the development that was put in the original expansion plan has occurred, but not all of it has. And so you can see here from the west area and the north area, there's been 17 and 11 roughly acres of impact, and then mitigation constructed to offset that. One thing before we go to the next slide that I wanted to talk about is that this wetland replacement plan an application is also part of a planned unit development application that Burnsville Sanitary Landfill has in. So there's a lot of things that the city is looking at outside of the wetland impacts, but tonight we are just focused on the wetland impacts mitigation and how that is proposed to be done through their expansion. And so we are hoping to take this permit application to City Council at the same time as that planned unit development application, and currently that's scheduled for August 16th. So that's where we're at. I'm going to have Ashley now with Kimley Horn go over the proposed project, some of the changes, what we're looking at now today, and help answer any questions. And then at the end, just to be clear, we are looking for a motion to recommend approval of this application to City Council.
Thanks, Daryl. So as you can see on the screen, there's been a few changes to the proposed development areas within the site, and as a result of that, some of the wetland impacts have changed. So the total wetland impacts for what they're considering the annex development area, their ADA, is 29.3 acres, which is actually a reduction in the overall wetland impacts by 1.31 acres. For the wetland fill that was going to be compared to the north development area, or the NDA. So total for the total project is a reduction in wetland impacts. The proposed mitigation for this application that came in is a purchase of bank credits for the remaining portion of the mitigation that needs to be complete. So it's a 2-to-1 mitigation ratio. So the applicant is proposing to purchase wetland mitigation bank credits from account number 1636. So as Daryl had mentioned earlier, some mitigation has been constructed on site or adjacent sites. Some restoration has occurred over the years, some purchase of wetland bank credits. So the remaining credit that is needed for the project is 7.82 acres of mitigation credit or of wetland. And so the city received a copy of that purchase agreement on July 13th, 2022. So just to talk about the Wetland Conservation Act process, an application was received at the end of December for the revisions or a permit amendment because they still had a current permit in place. That permit amendment was noticed through the Wetland Conservation Act process and went out to the technical evaluation panel on January 13th of this year. The notice of application was sent out to renotice the application due to the reduction of wetland impacts and then also the change in mitigation. So instead of creating additional wetland on site, they were going to be purchasing bank credits for the remaining mitigation that was required. And so that went out for a 15-day public comment period. One comment was received on the application. The comment was related to which wetland credit mitigation bank would be used to fulfill the mitigation credits. There were no agency comments that were received. Prior to noticing this, we actually did have a conversation with our, at the time, the Bowser rep, just to discuss if this needed to go out on renotice and what that process would look like, just knowing that there was a current permit in place for more wetland impact than what is currently being proposed. And so that was renoticed, and then the change in mitigation did also require a renotice for that. And so just up on the screen, this was also provided in the packet, is just kind of an overall visual of the different footprints. So as you can see on the screen, it's a little bit small, or if you can look at the packet, it shows the current permitted NDA footprint and then what was permitted as part of the WDA. And then they are showing, if you can see on the screen, there's the purple kind of magenta other colored boundary. That is the proposed new footprint for the ADA, shows the wetland impacts, and then also some of the north mitigation that was out there. So as you can see, some of the mitigation or some of the wetland impacts that were proposed originally will also be impacted as a result of the change in the footprint. And then you can kind of see where some of the other wetland boundaries are out on the site. So the recommendation is for, the staff recommends approval of the wetland permit and the replacement plan to go to City Council. there any questions?
Yeah, Mark Cleveland. I'm curious about comments from the TEP relative to the past delineations. Did they ask for a new delineation? It's a pretty old delineation, 18 years. So
Yeah, so the TEP did not request or did not request a new delineation, did not comment on the age of the delineation.
okay,
We actually didn't receive any comments from the agencies on this application. Like I said, we did have a conversation with Ben Carlson. He was the current Bowser rep. There's a new Bowser rep at this point for Dakota County. But we did have a conversation with him just about the overall application, what they were proposing, and the change in mitigation. And so he actually didn't provide any comments on the application or on the notice of application.
okay. Additionally, I'm curious about, there's been a fair amount, there was 48 acres of original wetland impacts that's been shaved down some because of mitigation already purchased credits. Do you have a breakdown of that?
We do. Mike, do you want to? Mike is a consultant from Stantec that has worked on the project since
Okay.
the original application. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to share a little bit about the proposed mitigation. I know you had sent me some of the breakdown, but.
Yeah, sure. Mark, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, just, there's total of, I'd like to find out what the breakdown is of already mitigated projects, and, were they done on site?
Yeah.
Also, how much of that was, 29 acres or whatever. I'm not doing the math really straight in my head because it's not real clear what the breakdowns have been.
I probably can't give you precise numbers. I can give you a pretty good overview of what's
Pretty
going
good
on
overview
as
would
far
work.
as impacts and how mitigation has occurred over
Yeah.
since the permits were issued in the mid-2000s. So there were 2 permits issued for this project. The west development area was that 17.29 acre area that was up on the screen earlier. All of that is done.
Yeah.
Then of the 30.61 acres originally in the NDA permit, about 11.3 acres of impact have been done with regard to what used to be called the NDA. All of that most of that's occurring now in the ADA project, which is the new proposed project, which reduces the total impacts by 1.31 acres. So regarding the WDA mitigation, as I said, all that impact has already occurred. There were a couple of wetland banks that credits were purchased from for that, and also for some of the impacts in the NDA of the 11.3 that have already occurred. So there's been some banking credits already done to mitigate some of these impacts from a couple of mitigation banks in the mid-2000s that I don't believe either of those banks are in the system anymore. I think they've sold out long since. There was also some on-site mitigation done up along the north. That blue polygon you see on the screen there up in the northwest corner, that's called the North Mitigation Area, and about 7 acres of that
10.7.
were constructed in 2007.
Okay.
So that's on site. Along the west side there, you see kind of those blue polygons around Wetland D, Wetland C. There's 3 polygons there, if you look carefully, of mitigation that was done on the site there. And the total of those 3 wetlands is about 1.9 acres. So that's on-site mitigation. We also did an upstream mitigation project, a floodplain restoration project a couple miles upstream from here on other people's property of 6.61 acres. So there's buffers, there's upland buffers in this mix as well. So my math isn't going to make a lot of sense if you add those numbers up that I just gave you. But there's been upland buffers on site and also at that site upstream that were part of the mitigation package that's been done.
All right, thanks, because I think it's important to try to do as much within the watersheds as possible. I noticed that the other credits that are going to be purchased or recommended are over on the Lincoln Lion or Yellow Medicine, boundaries.
Yeah, I think those are from Sibley County now, the ones we're buying. I could be wrong about that, but they're in VSA 9. So the problem is that there's just a shortage of credits, generally speaking, especially closer to the metro. So the rules do allow for replacing within the BSA, and we've gotten the site as close as we could find within the BSA, the bank service area, to be able to find mitigation.
I'm also curious about so the core representative of the, on the TAP didn't have any comments or questions about changes in flood relative to, thank you, Mike. Sure. To 404 kinds of things and floodways things. It does look like the mitigation project is obviously closer to the river. This is actually pulling it further back. The project area is pulling it back from the river, so probably less flood impact. But I was curious if that came up at all.
It did not.
Okay.
We didn't receive any comments from the Corps representative.
All right. Thanks.
Any other questions?
The presentation was a lot simpler than the packet. I got a headache with that packet.
There's a lot of numbers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information.
And there's no need to do anything with rusty patch or any of the other endangered species now that have come on board since this process began. I saw that the cricket frogs were looked for and listened for. Anything with rusty patch?
Nothing with Rusty Patch on this one. I'm not sure if it is within the high potential zone. We would need to double check that. But for the cricket frog, they did do a survey. I know that there is ongoing coordination with the DNR regarding that.
Yeah. I've never heard cricket frogs in 25 years of doing surveys in Dakota County, so I don't know. But that's not here, so.
My only question for those of us who are newer to this project, can you explain what would be the impact if we chose not to vote in approval for this?
So there's a couple different outcomes that could happen. Essentially, the way the city council process works is if there's a unanimous vote, then it is something that could be handled by consent agenda at the city council level. If the council members choose to do that, council members can always pull items off that agenda to discuss them if they want to. If it is a split vote, but still an approval, we would just take it as a regular council item. And if the vote was against the project or against the application, then we would still take it to city council, noting that recommendation, that it came before this body. This was the presentation, here was the vote, and we would proceed that way.
Let me clarify my question.
Yep.
So if it's not approved, what would be the impacts of this project? Does that make sense? So like,
Oh,
if
you
we're
mean
like,
if the city council didn't approve it?
correct.
So
Sorry
if the
for
city
that.
council didn't approve it, then this project would be in a tough spot.
What would the environmental impacts be?
Well, they wouldn't be able to impact these wetlands,
Okay.
essentially.
So it's like full protection, making sure everything's okay.
Yes, if they didn't approve this permit, then Waste Management or Burnsville Sanitary Landfill would not be able to impact the wetlands as it exists now. I don't know, there'd be other processes to go from there, but essentially once council, if they did decide to do that, then yes, they don't have approval then to do those impacts.
Perfect, thank you.
Commissioners, backing up to Darrell's first answer there, should any of you oppose this project tonight, council has always asked that you express your reasons for why you would vote no on this type of project, so.
So one thing I think that not everybody has a lot of background on the Wetland Conservation Act. WACA stuff is very, very dense sometimes. But maybe if you could describe for us the role of the TEP and their role in the regulatory process and approval processes that, that a project goes through.
Sure. So there is what we mentioned here. It's called the TEP. It's the Technical Evaluation Panel. It's made up of, city representative, county, SWCD, Minnesota DNR, Board of Water and Soil Resources, the Army Corps of Engineers. They have their own permit process, but if they choose to participate in the Wetland Conservation Act one, they can. And then watersheds. They have an opportunity to have a representative. And so it is a large collective of professionals that get to see the application from the beginning, essentially once we notice it. And then for most projects in Burnsville, we do a site visit with the technical evaluation panel so they can come out, look at the wetlands, they review the mitigation, and then as Ashley mentioned, there's a comment period where that panel can submit their comments essentially to the city. So the city of Burnsville, the way it does work here is the city of Burnsville is the local government unit which administers the Wetland Conservation Act. So our staff here and our city council are the ones that approve or deny or do the different stuff with these wetland applications. So that TEP panel is like a recommendation panel. We provide their information. They get feedback into what they think about the project or the impacts. And I think with this one, I will say I've been at Burnsville for 18 years, and this so I started in 2004, which is like when this project started. And this is definitely probably the most unique wetland project that I've ever been on. Because of all the different pieces, as Mike mentioned, we've got mitigation, on-site, off-site, bank credits. So it is complicated, but I will say, because so much work went into the wetland review process, as Mike mentioned, it started in 2001. I think there was an approval in 2004, and there may have been one, because he said there was 2 different permits, there may have been one even after that. So there's a lot of time spent analyzing the wetlands, the potential impacts, and looking at avoidance and minimizing the amount of impacts possible. And so I think when this came up again for review, when people looked at all the information we had from the past and seeing that that was actually already approved and permitted, the fact that this new modification actually decreases the amount of impacts, wetland impacts, slightly, that it allowed folks to feel comfortable not submitting, like as Ashley said, we went through the process, we didn't get comments, and I think that's why, because a lot of work was put in the beginning, in the early 2000s, and then now what they're coming back with is actually a reduction of what was already permitted. So I think that's where you're seeing, I would maybe say, well, there's no comments from the TEP, that's kind of odd, but it's because so much work was done on this site previously, I think.
So you have 2 sets of TEPs essentially because of the length of the time in between. I recognize some names, but I didn't recognize other names. And it did seem like the materials that were sent talked about the fact that this looks like this removes impacts to some higher quality floodplain forest and moves those impacts, albeit slightly smaller, to more disturbed and less intact. I didn't see much about the understory. I just saw about the larger silver maples and cottonwoods, which are important in that setting. But I didn't, any descriptions of the understory outside of, I saw the disturbed areas had a lot of reed canary grass or hybrid cattail, but.
As was mentioned, there was not a reed delineation done, so there was not, going out. As you can see, the site is very large, the wetland area, the boundary to read all that would have been significant. And so I would agree that, as you can see, the way this boundary has shifted, it has pulled it back from the river. The potential most northern point of impacts has come back from the original approvals. there is a preservation of some areas of wetland that are in higher quality than some of the areas being disturbed now that would have potentially been disturbed under the old permit. And so I think that's important to remember as we look at this is Burnsville Sanitary Landfill actually already had permits to impact this. And so, if they didn't come in with the redesign, if they hadn't looked at this, they would have been able to move forward with the previous approvals. And so, from my standpoint, this is a better overall plan from a wetland perspective, from a natural resources perspective. Although the change is not huge, there is some other benefits, like Commissioner Cleveland mentioned, that overall, in my mind, makes this a more positive proposal from that natural resource perspective than what was previously approved, so.
Okay. Thank you, because you got at my question a little bit better than I was able to articulate it.
Mine too.
Oh, good. So what we're doing, so just to clarify, we're looking at, so like where the landfill is at currently, they could spread it out, so to speak, a little bit more. And so this is actually allowing them less room for the landfill, correct?
I don't know,
Space?
I actually don't know about that overall. I know it is less wetland impact.
Okay, so it's just the impact on the wetland only.
That's what we're looking at tonight, yes.
Is there any way to convince them to leave the wetlands alone even more?
So, Ed, when we went through the process, I think,
If I smile nicely and,
so, I mean, obviously, this is the proposal that they put in front of us. It is already reduced footprint, and I am not an expert on operating a landfill. And so, when we looked at this project a lot more in-depth with the wetland stuff, there was a lot of avoidance, sequencing, and other things that went through the original applications in the early 2000s. And so, I think when you look at landfills and how they operate and kind of what they need, this landfill, like I said, there's a whole planned unit development that goes along with this that is, much more in-depth on other aspects than just the wetland impacts. And so, like I said, from my point, they have made improvements on the aspect of the wetland impacts as part of this project, so, I mean, there is, I know, some work that went into it to come up with this alignment, so.
The WACA is responsible for administering wetland law in Minnesota. So one of the core things is the no loss, and I think this is kind of one of those balancing act things that and it's always I've always viewed it as preferable to do mitigation. But they do avoidance. But in some of those documents that were sent out, there was discussions of the sequencing parts of it, and the fact that 2 TEPs of wetland professionals have gone over this has struck me as interesting that there were no additional comments. They must have, but the fact that it was reviewed gives it a fair amount of standing. And but yeah, the no loss thing is so that was really why I was looking for Mike to kind of fill in some of the blanks on what the breakdown was, because a lot of times bigger projects like this kind of wetland are going to impact having a bunch of the puzzle pieces be some mitigation, some purchase credit. It's not it's something that oftentimes does happen. There aren't a lot of large banks out there, and there aren't a lot of mitigation opportunities to make sure that there is no loss. So, and it sounds like am I correct in that the landfill folks said, okay, let's reconsider this? They could have just gone straight forward with what was on paper, what was already approved, and despite its age, and they decided to pull back and to try to lessen the footprint. Then I'm sure that they must have had an operational reason, but
Yes, so, I mean, that is, right, so the city, they had their approvals from the city for that stuff in the early 2000s. And as mentioned, as you can see from our numbers, they had not maximized that area yet. They hadn't made all the impacts and done all the work with the waste and stuff. So now there obviously is probably things that makes this more conducive to their operation. But that doesn't mean that it isn't also better for the natural resources out there. And so when, when they came in with their proposal and said, we want to do an amendment, we want to try to look at this, for my role in the review process, it did sell itself fairly easily to say, versus what, since I had worked on it from the beginning, I've been involved at least a little bit on the front end in the early 2000s, what was approved before, what's out there. I've been on the site many times monitoring these mitigation sites, because once they're constructed, you do have to monitor them and submit reports for 5 or 7 years afterwards. And so I've been out there, many times over the years looking at those. And so when they brought this in, overall, from an initial look, I didn't have a lot of concerns with what they were proposing, so.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, are we ready to vote?
I move that we approve the wetland permit and replacement plans for the Burnsville Sanitary landfill.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? I will be honest in that I was planning to abstain from this one. However, I will vote in favor, given that the risk is, if it isn't approved, they would be under the old plan. I would like to see less footprint even, but I also understand that is not what this is about. So I will vote aye. All right, and that motion passes. Miscellaneous items. Our next meeting is in August, August 15th, 2022. Unless there's a surprise before then.
Commissioners, I promise I will do everything I can to not surprise you before August 15th. And August 15th, we are looking at doing another field trip, as we do annually, either out in our park system or to a facility or something of that nature, so.
Lovely. All right, at this time, I will request a call for adjournment of the July 18th, 2022 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting. Do I have a motion?
I move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? And that passes, and we will see you in August, everyone.